Right. So me and Simon both chose fairly similar topics. Where I chose the sort of the nobility from China, and Simon chose the nobility from Japan, which obviously quite a bit of nobility too.
Yeah, quite specifically, for me, specifically the samurai, but a lot of things. I think maybe you should go first, Henry, because a lot of what China did was later adopted by Japanese nobility anyway.
Well, maybe that's why I think you should start.
Oh,
because I don't want to cover, old ground.
That's a fair point. Sorry, I throw a little there. Let me speak up a bit as well. That'd probably help. So, in regards to Japan and its samurai, that's where it gets very weird, because it is very much like a parallel of European chivalry, but obviously there are some pretty key differences to denote. Mainly how Japanese, at least around about the, I believe it's like the 12th century. I'm sorry, I'm terrible with dates. I believe it was around about the 12th century is when the military office of shogun appeared, which was, well, I say office, I mean military government. Like, it was very weird. They had a parallel system where you had a civil government, which was ran by the emperor, but then you had a military government, which is ran by the shogun. And weirdly enough, though, that was kind of the one that had the most power, and that's where the sort of samurai virtues come in, or Bushido, as some people call it, which did exist for a while as its own sort of separate entity, and it was very much a not too dissimilar to chivalry in that it was meant to be a exemplification of certain virtues, but they were mostly martial prowess. And but as much as it was martial prowess, there was a lot of things about the role that were incredibly ceremonial, like the good grief. I'm gonna upset some people who are gonna be like, "Oh no, it was totally a legit weapon, guys." For example, the katana was mostly a ceremonial weapon symbolic of your status as a samurai if you were carrying one. It wasn't necessarily a weapon you wanted to use. And apparently most samurai preferred to use something akin to a yari, a long spear.
Yeah, you get the same thing with knights, actually. It's quite an interesting comparison, where the typical arming sword that you would associate with the medieval period is actually more of a sidearm in most cases, especially later on, where your primary weapon is actually some kind of polearm.
Yeah. I mean, I think where it gets kind of interesting is that there was never really like a separate... I guess it just speaks to the very military nature of Japan during this period and for the longest time, and it was the whole concept of, not only did these samurai have like this role of being as close as you can get to a professional soldier and kind of serving as officers in the military, so they would usually actually be in control of the professional army or of the peasants who were drafted into the army. So while these samurai were, I would say, the equivalent of like a military officer, they were usually in command of a small number of forces in the army in general. And while their general would also technically be a samurai, he is of a higher rank all the same. So there was still like a ranking system. It's just the samurai will usually be forming your officers. So they'd be from your like lieutenant upwards to your general. But they also covered, as far as I can tell, they also covered the role of policing, and that's maybe where the katana was actually most useful. It was for self-defense in police situations as opposed to military situations, because, I mean, you're kind of asking to provoke a fight if you start walking around, your little feudal Japanese village decked out in your full samurai garb, carrying your spear and your katana all the time. At least if you have just the katana, you still fairly blend in, but you still have your status symbol on your waist, at least.
You can cut down the rowdy commoners.
Yeah, which as a side note gets kind of interesting, because then that's when another sidearm for the samurai showed up, where they had an even shorter little katana called, I think it's like a wasakaji or something like that, and it was just a short sword because they realized that swinging around a katana indoors is very difficult. But the whole concept of Bushido gets really interesting because as I was looking it up, this whole samurai honor code existed since the inception of the samurai, but it was never called Bushido until around about the 17th century. So it was just very curious to see, and it was also around about that time that it also got strongly influenced by, of all things, Zen Buddhism and Confucius. And that's when you got and specifically what it got from Confucius was the example of the example of the perfect gentleman. And so at that point, it suddenly became very clear that the samurai was supposed to be active role models for everybody in that society.
Much like the knight became.
But then there's a lot of things, however, where, as per usual, when you start trying to incorporate other ideas into an existing system, it gets complicated and contradictory to a very massive fault. Like, for example, one of the key tenets of Bushido is, I might butcher the pronunciation because it's not a word I'm used to, filial piety.
I recognise the term, but what does that mean?
It basically means to have respect and basically venerate your elders, or more specifically, your parents.
Yeah, that's a more general Asian thing, as I understand it.
Well, I think that's because it came from Confucius.
Well, it existed in Europe before as well, but that got tied up more into general dynasty worship, I think. Or no, not dynasty worship, but reverence of dynasties rather than specifically, the people who your parents were.
The reason why I say it gets a bit contradictory, especially with the idea of filial piety, is that the original tenets that were, combined with Confucius to create the more modern Bushido system would then have things where, like, for example, the service of your lord came before anything else, but yet it still stressed this, respect of your parents kind of thing, even though doing what you need to do for the sake of your lord could possibly put you to blows against your own family. But the whole thing is basically demanding, no, you must do everything you can for your lord, while also demanding you do everything you can for your family.
So did you say that was more of a later edition, or was that there?
It was definitely a later edition. I think that the filial piety thing came from Confucius specifically.
Well, Confucius goes further back, I think, than really when we think of the samurai of, say, the Sengoku Jidai era and the 17th century. So, well, unless it just took a very long time to bring the ideas of Confucius over, which might have been very much the case. I don't know, but
yeah, it might have just been some later influence. Because Confucius was very, very old.
But so there are a lot of like contradictory stuff, which is where I know it's maybe not the best example, but there's the story of the I believe it's called the 47 Ronin.
I was just going to ask about that actually, yeah.
And for those of you who don't know, a Ronin is a samurai who has become masterless. His lord has died, and he has been, for the most part, stripped of his honor. So he is a Ronin rather than a samurai. And it's kind of a state of dishonor as opposed to an honorable samurai, if that makes sense.
Kind of like a societal outcast of sorts.
Yeah, and the story of the 47 Ronin is that their master, their lord, was basically betrayed and killed, but because he died, and it's not the nature of his death that mattered, it was the fact that he died on their watch is what dishonored them. And yet that lord still became... The traitor to this lord still became what some would consider an honorable individual. I do believe he either became the shogun or became a close advisor of the shogun. But in order to reclaim their honor, these 47 Ronin basically exacted revenge upon him. But exacting revenge upon him was also a violation of Bushido because of his status and title. And so even though they technically achieved what they needed to achieve and could restore their honor, they also broke their code in a different way to be dishonored, so then they all committed seppuku. And that was
ritualistic suicide for the uninitiated.
Yeah, they committed this ritualistic suicide in order to restore their honor. Which, by the way, the ritualistic suicide only appeared around about the time it was started to be called Bushido, which was about the 16th century.
I didn't know that, but that starts to coincide with the period in which they become more of a bureaucratic entity, as I understand it, and a kind of civil service of sorts, rather than a purely martial entity. Is that right?
Yeah, that's roughly around about the time, though. I think it's one of those things where you adapt as things go on. So initially, samurai were martial, then they started to fill in a more of a civil role, and then the whole idea of the civil role got codified into their honor code.
Yeah, but had they had that element all the way through? So
that's the thing. I'm not
so the
sure.
expectation of being literate and poets.
I'm
and,
sure it's very difficult. It's very difficult to find and see, and also a lot of literature and poetry in the Japanese aristocracy was weirdly written by women of all things. Like they were the history keepers instead for whatever reason. It's hard to say why.
Interesting.
I guess they just had nothing better to do with their time.
Yeah, maybe.
Sorry, go on. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to bring it around to what we're actually ultimately trying to talk about. But if you've got more to add to the context, then.
Well, I feel like I want to try and because what I've said is incredibly imperfect, and I know I will have made mistakes somewhere, because the problem about trying to understand Bushido, just carte blanche, the whole thing, is unfortunately it's a bit like trying to understand Norse mythology because most people understand it through the Prose Edda, which was made way after any like actual accounts of Norse mythology. And it's the same here, where a lot of accounts of Bushido were in a book called Bushido, The Soul of Japan, written by, I've forgotten his name now, whatever. And it was written in around about like the turn of the century, 19th to 20th century, and it was kind of a bit of a fluff piece for Imperial Japan and to kind of like romanticize samurai and things like that. And that's where a lot of people, for whatever reason, get their knowledge on Bushido, even though it's an imperfect source and it's a very biased source.
Yeah, makes sense. So with all that in mind, and what the idea of Bushido and what the samurai were trying to embody and what was encouraged. Oh, actually, that's one other thing, because we're talking about it in every case. What was there an avenue for regular old peasants to become samurai?
I believe there was, but it was very much the same as you put it in terms of knights, which is, as far as I can tell, and from what I read, and again, this is going to be probably very vague because I'm still not overly sure, is Japan had drafted armies and also a professional army, and basically if you were part of that professional army and you displayed a high enough martial prowess in a battle, or just basically in any situation where you get to show off how good you are in combat to someone who might be watching, be it a samurai or a lord or higher, and then you might be bestowed the honor of eventually becoming a samurai. It's very hard to say. I would almost argue it's way stricter than European knights when it came to trying to promote from the peasantry, as it were.
Yeah, but still kind of an ad hoc sort of arrangement where if you get noticed by someone powerful, then they might raise you.
Yeah, it might, but it's very difficult to say, and it's very much you really have to prove yourself.
I mean, maybe there's just some of this that we're not getting, but it does seem kind of interesting that there's so much more emphasis put on the actions of the person who's fulfilling this role, and yet it's open to a very select group of people. It almost seems contradictory in that sense. Whereas at least when you have the senators and such or rather the patricians in Rome, they had that kind of additional element of being closer to the gods, as Kurtz put it.
There's a lot in Japan that seems incredibly contradictory. Like, obviously, things like assassination are not considered honorable, and yet where the blame of it being a dishonorable act is put on the assassin themselves rather than the person who hired the assassin. So it's entirely possible that you as a samurai might have someone else who is also a samurai but a rival, and you have them assassinated. Even if people could prove that you were the one who assassinated them, that still doesn't harm your status at all, even though it is quite a dishonorable thing to do, obviously.
Odd.
Yeah, a bit. It's one of those things where I'd argue it's a system very ripe for abuse by the select few that are within it.
Yeah. So, okay, bringing this around then. Does anybody else have anything that they any other questions or anything before we move on to?
Just something I was going to add to the thing about assassination and that being dishonorable in Japan. I remember seeing something. I can't remember exactly what war it was about, but it was around a pretty major war that was happening in Japan. That was about different families or groups trying to wrestle power away from one another, and there were a good amount of assassinations that were carried out in that time, and it was mostly samurai doing those assassinations, and it was an interesting contrast to notice that the samurai, the ones who were supposed to be these exemplars of the morals of the time, are the ones who are constantly breaking it, trying to assassinate people. I think there was one man who was while he was sleeping, they set fire to the house he was in, or something along those lines. It's the samurai doing this when the ninjas who were involved in this conflict, who are the peasant warriors, who you would typically imagine in popular culture as being sneaky assassins, they were the ones who were more frequently upholding their honor, so to speak.
Well, they had a code, but it was much looser, just based on their station in society. And again, it's kind of where you really start to poke holes in this whole idea of Bushido and honorable samurai, is when it's just there's so many like choice moments you can pick out of Japanese history, and just it does give you a bit of a big think. Like, for example, I forgot which period it was, but it would have been, he eventually did become the shogun, which was Nobunaga Oda, who at one point his enemies took refuge in a Buddhist temple, and obviously the Japanese at the time, even to this day, take it very seriously about not doing anything to damage a temple or hurt anyone within. Nobunaga had no such reservations and immediately burnt the whole place down, killing his enemies who had sought refuge in there along with the monks, and his samurai just completely went along with it.
I believe that's how he himself died, actually. I can believe that he did it as well, because he had a particularly vicious campaign against some of the warrior monks up in the mountains. But yeah, I believe it was one of his allies that set fire to a temple that he was staying in.
I learnt it from you.
Yeah. I was going to say that I'm pretty sure he very much disliked the warrior monks. I think it continued on for a bit after that, where they were just trying to get rid of them because they were a separate entity to the samurai class. So that had quite a lot of political power that they didn't like. Yeah.
And they also occupied quite a few strategically important places, I believe. I'm not entirely sure, but that could mean that if you made an enemy out of them, then they could shut down parts of the country by, not letting things through certain areas and things like that.
As much as I might have sounded like I was kind of hyping the whole thing up, but it's it's one of these things where I was just speaking about what the theory is, but in practice, samurai didn't really seem to follow their own warrior code very well, to a point where it seemed very, very out in the open, and I don't know if that... I'd have to look it up specifically, because I know that a lot of these conflicts sort of appeared before the idea of Bushido itself kind of became a proper combined name, and also had the Confucianism added into it and the Zen Buddhism.
Well, it is worth noting, though, that even if not all parts of that were maintained at all times, it does seem like, so to get on to what the actual wider effect of having this particular aristocratic class was, it does seem like that element of loyalty in the extreme does seem to have had a lasting impact.
Yeah, so that's the two definite tenets that seem to be strictly upheld, regardless of your opinions on them, like burning down a fucking temple. is the whole idea of martial prowess and loyalty to your lord. Those are basically the two tenets that they will do their best to not violate.
Looking at it from a certain perspective, that kind of thing still exists today in terms of the commonly associated means of advancement in Japanese society, or well, the business world at least, is to demonstrate extreme loyalty to your boss.
And also your martial prowess, got to be able to decapitate your enemies.
I mean, the thing to remember with that is that much of the society is carried over from, at least sort of pre-World War II and during World War II, it was much the same sort of system, and they carried much the same spirit, at least, through into it.
Which is also why, people get confused about like the World War II tactics of booby-trapping bodies and banzai charges out of the grass.
Although, I think it probably is worth making that distinction between the sort of earlier samurai period, where it was strictly more of a warrior class, and the later samurai period, which mixed the warrior element with, the academic, bureaucratic element.
Basically it seems from what I've been reading, and again, my understanding is relatively vague, is instead of trying to create a new gentleman class, they kind of just tried to roll the old samurai class into it, or add those elements to the samurai class instead.
Yeah. So my statement was on the assumption that it wasn't a continuous thing throughout the life of the samurai. It may well have been. I don't know. Well, you can write books on this subject, many, many books.
Oh yeah. I mean, for example, the reason why it is called Bushido is it does mean warrior's way, and the term Bushi does mean warrior, and refers to a warrior class. So that should give you an idea. They were
always warriors first and foremost.
So that might explain the die-hard loyalty aspect to the whole thing.
Okay. Do we think that influenced Japanese culture and society in any other particular way?
Massively, I think, to the point where the after effects are still around today.
Yeah.
Intense loyalty to just about anything. Anyone who your boss in Japan is kind of the equivalent of your lord, so of course you show him all your loyalty, and in return he's meant to look after you, kind of situation. At least that's where I'm getting. At least that's the impression I'm getting from the whole idea.
I wonder if there may have been an impact due to the fact that there wasn't a clear delineation between samurai and non-samurai, and yet, in terms of how they can act in society, there's such an enormous difference. So, for example, to flip this round to the inverse, you have the untouchables who are below even the peasants, and ethnically there's very little difference between most Japanese people and the untouchables, yet they are treated as a subclass, and I think that maybe builds into this kind of relative reverence of tradition, without questioning it to the same extent that you might get in other places.
Yeah, though the Untouchables is such a weird thing to have appeared, and the reasons why it appeared are so strange.
I know there's a whole lot of sort of spiritual baggage that goes along with that, but just the phenomenon and why it seems to be not unquestioned, but it seems to have been accepted despite there not being, some kind of genetic quality to this all. It's just something that kind of everybody accepts, even though there's no clear reason, directly in front of you as to why that would be the case.
To maybe pull a little bit from last week's podcast, there is maybe there is kind of a genetic element, because you've got to keep in mind that the Untouchables' ancestors would have basically been undertakers, prostitutes, people who do generally not just menial work that nobody really wants to do, or it is never associated very highly.
Yeah. And certainly there'll probably be a more pronounced effect now that there's been some separation through not allowing them to intermarry and such, but
that's what I mean. So there might have been, just based on, to be blunt, IQ differences, there may have been a underlying genetic difference.
Personality differences, maybe.
Yeah, and just not an ethnic one.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's stop tangenting and move on to the next one.
Yes, finally. Henry, do you want to go ahead and round this out?
Yes. So the way that I sort of approach this, I suppose, is from there's a point fairly late on where it's quite a clear cut from the influence in terms of the influence of the aristocracy in China. But I'll talk about that slightly later. I suppose the first place to start, at least the thing I've got here, is that it seems to me fairly sort of driven by the sort of female members of the society. So due to familial familial hierarchy, sort of loyalty to your family, the mother of the emperor, I'm taking fairly top down, by the way. The mother of the emperor, who has a special title of Empress Dowager, she had a massive influence on the emperor himself and therefore on the society in general. And so much of the actual political power was being done by her rather than by the emperor himself. Although obviously not totally. And it was more of a hinting thing from what I can say rather than actual, okay, go ask the Empress Dowager rather than the emperor.
I was just going to ask, if it was a formalized thing or if it was just because she was someone who was close to the emperor.
I think, from what I can tell, it's just because she's close to the emperor and has an authority over him that you wouldn't get otherwise. And even in terms of sort of becoming a member of the aristocracy or sort of gaining and lowering in rank, it was mainly, from what I can tell, based on intermarrying. And so the higher in rank you are, the more concubines you have. And your rank as a child is based on the rank of your mother rather than the rank of your father. So if you are the concubine to the emperor, your title is one rank below the son of the emperor. Although the emperor, it sort of depends. It's a bit fiddly. Because he has something like 120 concubines at varying tiers. But,
Whoa.
yeah, it's a bit excessive. The other way of this sort of mobility taking place is, and I can't pronounce it, enfeffing, where you're giving fiefs and titles to, I think it's your defeated enemies, but it does depend on who they are. So if you're conquering all of China and overthrowing the current dynasty in power, then you will definitely give that dynasty like a duke tier title.
Someone hasn't read Machiavelli.
But you'd give them some title, you'd give them some land, and they would still be around. The idea being that you give them the means to honor their ancestors and the ancestors of the dynasties that they have done the same to in the past.
I mean, that's a quite an interesting point that's worth hovering on in itself, because it does encourage, I guess, an emperor or a dynasty to not be determined to go down with the ship because it's all or nothing proposition. There is an out whereby even if you lose and even if you accept defeat, then you will have something left. So why throw away your life and why throw away everything?
And still have quite a lot of power.
Yeah.
But the only issue is that I don't know how far that extended. It might have just been, emperors to, like, if you've overthrown someone, then you get a duke title. Otherwise, if you're like a duke against another duke, I don't know if that translated as well. I couldn't see. But it does, as you say, it definitely promotes this idea of surrendering, I suppose, but not, I don't know. There's a couple of different mechanisms, like the mandate of heaven is another mechanism where it eases the transitions between the different dynasties and different rulers, where if, say, for example, a rebellion happens and an emperor is overthrown, there's not some great uproar about it. It's just that people consider that emperor has clearly lost the mandate of heaven. Because if they had the mandate of heaven, they wouldn't have lost the rebellion. Yeah,
it's a tool for post hoc legitimization.
Yeah.
And establishing a continuity between dynasties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Well, there's quite a lot written about that, which is quite interesting, by Mencius, I believe.
Mencius Montbug?
Well, named himself after the ancient Chinese writer. No, the original Mencius.
Yeah. But yeah, so that's basically all I'll talk about with the pre-Mandarin stage of Chinese civilization, if you have any questions so far.
I don't think so. At this stage, would the aristocracy just be the kind of knights, essentially, if we were to take a European comparison? that they are just commanders and lower level but high ranking soldiers.
Yeah, it does seem to be similar, like landowners and officers, ones that would, so if you go by the number of concubines you're allowed, there's the common citizen who's not allowed any, and then officers are allowed one, and then it goes up further. But then that's sort of, I don't know, that's an example or an indication for me at least of your tier in society, although that's just because I can't be bothered to remember the bloody different tiers and the different dynasties, because it does change quite a lot based on the different period you're talking about.
Can I just say that's a very funny metric? What determines the aristocracy? Are you allowed to have concubines, and how many concubines do you have?
Aristocracy as determined by pimping.
Yes. Anyway, so this transitions into...
Yeah, so... Yeah, it varies from dynasty to dynasty and time period to time period. It's very old. But when you get to around like 700 AD, so we're still talking quite far back, they introduced this Imperial college system, where if you want to be a government official or anything like that, you need to have gone through this education with quite a strict curriculum, which teaches you a fairly limited view of things like how you interpret art and how you run things, basically. And so it limited the power of the hereditary aristocracy, and opened the doors to the more, not like every commoner, but for those that aren't particularly high up the hierarchy to get quite close to the emperor.
I thought it was basically everyone, actually. That as long as you raise the money in order to be able to take the exams, then...
Well, that's what it means, that you need to raise the money to take the exam.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
But you wouldn't be just, poor little beggar boy, suddenly, next day you're meeting the emperor.
Yeah.
What else am I talking about? Yes, so it sort of spelled an end for the aristocracy in that sense. And I can't remember what else I was going to talk about. Give me a second.
Well, just to fill in some of that gap then, because it is interesting how this becomes a mechanism for centralization. And that's not something that I talked about in the case of the European knights, but a lot of the, higher level knights and lower level sort of landholders did eventually start taking more of this kind of position of bureaucrats, effectively, of a certain sort. But were also sidelined by other lower level bureaucrats who came up from the kind of more petty bourgeoisie or whatever, and were able to just be a subordinate entity to the king who could augment the king's power over more regional nobles, as you were sort of describing in the transition to a more imperially focused, centralized system in China. Yeah, definitely.
Because it meant that instead of being a lot of the pre and post Mandarin, Mandarin, I realised I didn't define it as just a bureaucrat, like scholar, so someone who's been through this Imperial College. But so during that post time, that's a horrible English. Anyway, pre-Mandarin times and a little bit in the middle of it, it was mainly dominated by these fairly large, influential aristocrat families that would then be able to have access to the emperor and be able to intermarry and gain power that way. And the Imperial College basically just stopped that in its tracks, because it meant that the people that had access to the emperor were the people that could get through this college and were going through the system that way, rather than just the select few people.
Yeah, it certainly puts a very different dynamic on what is rewarded in society. So getting back to the, how does this affect wider society? What is promoted as the aristocracy? I think it's probably going to have some very clear delineated outcomes. But is there anything else you wanted to add before we get onto that?
Well, I don't think so, but I think I'd like to start with that.
Okay.
If you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
So, I mean, I'm basing this off of reading a fairly broad history of roughly what happened. But so from what I can tell, the pre-Mandarin days were similar to what we were talking about with the gentry and the samurai. It was fairly sort of military based, and that your status in your status and your title even was based on how much land you had and how much how well you performed in these wars. which obviously gives the aristocracy a bit of a martial outlook. But then after the Imperial College was introduced, it introduced this matter of, so particularly with the strict curriculum, it introduced this metric of, what's the word? Like tolerance and your ability to just sort of make yourself fit and fall in line.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean, Rupert? Give me the word.
No, the word eludes me, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. But yeah. And it seems to be more based on, I mean, it does introduce a level of meritocracy to it, but it means that it's more based on your performance in academics.
Yeah.
And how well you can kiss ass.
Yeah, so, I mean, those are the two big things that I would go to, that are debatably still showing in modern day, is that you still have a higher degree of competency in, well, for example, China has a slightly higher IQ on average than Europe, than European populations. Maybe some portion of this is due to this long history of selecting for very specifically, mental aptitude in order to apply resources, rather than being just a good warrior. Because a good warrior, although you do also have to be a bit intelligent, you can't be a dum-dum. But selecting specifically for that one thing and having a very set way of determining that with relatively open candidacy, I guess. That's not the word, but like opening it so that almost anybody who can get the funding to do so is able to go and take the test. And if they are sufficiently intelligent, then they get access to all of those resources that are going to allow their offspring the best chance to continue. Thus, they get more represented in the next generation. That might be some part of what we're observing when we see that the Chinese IQ is slightly higher on average.
You can argue, obviously, that was before the Imperial College was founded as well, because a lot of the social mobility was done based on who you could get your daughter to marry and how much you could afford to put into getting her meetings with higher up, not even necessarily aristocracy, but just people higher up in your sort of social sphere.
Yeah. Although that is a thing all over the place. That was very much a thing in Europe as well. Trying to get your daughter. Well, it's a combination there actually. It's a combination of marriage of political convenience and opportunity versus trying to get your daughter the best match. What else then? But so it does perhaps encourage the sort of Chinese Mandarin system. It does sort of perhaps encourage a degree of compliance. Maybe that's something that we see in modern day, because I think that has been studied, as I recall. That there's a higher degree of social compliance. Sorry?
I think compliance was the word I was looking for.
Oh, okay. That, compliance with authority. That's perhaps something that was encouraged through this mechanism of having the Mandarin system for such a long time. Those are the two things that jump out to me, but does anybody else have anything?
I'm not sure if you covered this, but I was just wondering in regards to social mobility, was it possible for a plebeian or a serf or whatever the equivalent of China at the time would have been called to become a member of this aristocracy, or is it a strict birthright?
I think
thing?
So. From what I can tell, for the individual themselves, it's a fairly strict birthright thing. But as I was saying before, is if you as a plebeian can save up and get your daughter to mingle and become like a concubine of someone higher up, then their children will be higher up in the society.
Wait, in the Mandarin system?
No, well, I think this system carried on even post-Imperial College times, but it was definitely before. But yeah, obviously in the Mandarin system, if you had enough money to go and join the Imperial College, you'd go and join the Imperial College. Yeah,
and I'm definitely aware of some instances where villages would all, pitch in for some local boy who didn't have the money himself, obviously, to go and take the exam, because if he passed it, then he could patronize the village basically and bring a lot of wealth back to where he came from as to repay the favor.
Take the money and run.
All right. Any other observations?
No, I think I'm good.
All right. So, big question then, being that we've observed how all of these aristocracies have affected the way that different cultures have developed and perhaps even left some kind of genetic impact. Which do we think is the most preferable in the long term? Or in retrospect, rather.
I mean, I feel like my answer is not Japan.
Why's that?
Well, while you can maybe argue for the long-term impact it's had now, I feel like the system itself was just too rife for like a weird type of abuse that seems to have caused more problems than it solved in a way.
So not worth it for the short-term damage it causes.
No, I don't think it is, really.
Okay, interesting angle. Anyone else? What do you think would be the best?
I'm leaning towards saying the European Knights system is best, just for the possibility of social mobility. If someone is truly capable and worthy of going from being a serf to being a knight, then that opportunity is there for them, and that the knight is enough of a part of their community and their life to act as a example that they can see and emulate to an extent.
It is definitely worth noting that even much later on, when this ceased to have as much of a direct military connotation or a martial connotation, the people who were the sort of landed aristocrats, those who stayed more in the countryside rather than all migrating into the cities, so particularly in the case of the French Revolution, the places that remained more staunchly royalist were typically the places where they still had the aristocrats around and mingling with people, rather than, off in Versailles trying to curry favour with the king. So that definitely implies a certain amount of more sort of organic mutual respect and stability of the system. Kind of,
Yeah.
There's another word that I'm looking for and I can't seem to find it.
Favour.
Yeah, sure.
So, I suppose for me, I'm as much as I'm tempted as much as I like the idea of the Imperial College, of having everyone who can afford to go being able to go and get an education and be able to get political power by getting close to the royalty if you perform well. I feel like it has much too much of an emphasis on your family above the individual. Of, okay, you may have a very small chance of going and meeting the king or the emperor, and based on that, your children might be able to marry someone else and then get higher in the social hierarchy than that. It seems a lot less focused on social mobility of the individual and rather trying to advance your family in the country more sort of long term, if I make any sense.
Yeah, no, I see what you mean. I don't necessarily dislike that, but it's certainly quite in stark contrast to the Roman system, where it's much more focused on the advancement of the individual patrician and the relationships that are sort of generated and nurtured are very much more towards the end of empowering the patrician, as in the man himself, which is probably where you get that kind of arms race of looking for ever more gravitas, for individual gravitas, and competing with one another on that basis, until you get somebody who breaks down the whole system in the form of Gaius Julius Caesar, just because, I mean, it's arguable as to why he did it, but, one of the reasons might well be because he was trying to outdo everyone else.
I mean, no matter what, you always get some tosser who's going to try and subvert everything. I mean, just look at the Gracchi brothers.
Yeah. But I don't know. Maybe we could look at the contrast between, say, the Chinese system, which is looking at it in a dynastic lens, and trying to think in multiple generational terms, versus the Roman system, which is thinking much more in terms of dynasty, but is very much more individually focused. That encourages the kind of ambition which can be very destructive.
I mean, that seems like very unique to Rome, because otherwise a lot of systems of nobility seem very dynastic in nature.
Yeah, a lot of them are. But you do also get characters that spring up from the European feudal system, the one that comes to mind is Simon de Montfort, who was taking on more of a self-aggrandizing role, I guess, in his dealings with the king and his involvement with the baronial rebellions. So what else is there to cover? I feel like this needs to be rounded out a little bit more. Okay, so for my piece, I guess I like there's different qualities of different systems that I like. So I like the presence that, so much like Kurtz says, I like the presence that that the nobility has in the case of the European system and also the Roman system. I think that generated a good... So the Roman system even more so because it generated that constant day-to-day relationship between a patron and his clients. And I think that's very healthy for the stability of the system and the kind of mutual respect at times as well.
Yeah, you need something. It helps to have a very pro-social relationship between different classes because then it helps build a repertoire and respect for each other that is kind of crucial to functioning together.
Exactly, and a situation where they can both gain something that the other has by like a mutually beneficial exchange. But obviously the bad part of the Roman system is definitely that something else that we didn't necessarily talk about is the direction in which it orients power in regards to, in the Roman system and also the Chinese system, I would say that they naturally have an orientation towards a more centralized, more urban power center. Thus, it probably goes some way towards drawing people into the cities where people have that freedom of choice in order to, get themselves closer to power and try to advance themselves. Whereas in the Japanese and European systems, the power is either slightly more diffuse and more able to reside in the countrysides comfortably, or encouraged to be from the countryside. Possibly in the case of the High Middle Ages, when you've got big castles that can command strategic areas.
Depending on what context you're going at for these sort of things. For me, the Japanese samurai system was very much about. I think it partly caused a lot of the warrings between the clans and everything because of just the fact that the samurai were loyal to a lord, and the lord wasn't necessarily loyal to anyone associated or above him. These lords didn't have to be, while they could claim to be loyal to the shogun, they didn't have to be, hyper loyal till death compared to their actual samurai, which I feel that absolute loyalty under penalty of being dishonored was maybe not very helpful for stability because there was no questioning of your lord.
Yeah, so it could draw the entire patches of the kingdom into, or the shogunate, or the country, whatever, into perhaps not the best line of policy.
Yeah, not the best line of policy, and also the fact that you could have, because I feel like in a lot of circumstances people are aware of when something is a really bad idea, or even if it's an idea they agree with or something, they know that it's being, the motivation behind it are not particularly virtuous. I feel like there would be a big difference between a lord deciding to try and depose of a shogun because that shogun is actively harmful to the country versus a lord who wants to depose the shogun because he purely just wants to be shogun himself now.
Yeah. Although, the positive of that kind of unwavering loyalty and unquestioning loyalty is that it reduces the requirements of, I guess, the investment of resources and time into preserving preserving that loyalty and preserving the obedience. I guess it reduces the coordination costs of doing anything.
Yeah,
because sorry, go on.
Yeah, though if I remember rightly, the kind of trade-off for this sort of for that sort of loyalty was more or less that the samurai did have a certain amount of autonomy on how they conducted themselves. It was very much a peer review system, if you know what I mean. Like, only other samurai could really judge samurai.
Yeah. But how did that work in relation to the daimyo in relation to samurai? Was that just a completely separate sort of situation, and only daimyos could judge other daimyos kind of thing, or?
I think that's where lines blur because of the fact that the daimyo would also be would not necessarily be of the samurai class, but they would also be taught relative things similar to the samurai. But I do feel like everyone was treated very differently, and it was very much you can only be judged by someone who is your equal. So there was that definite issue where, like you say, it seems very strongly it was the case that only lords could question each other or judge each other's decisions. But I feel like it wouldn't traverse downwards either, where a daimyo can't just can't just be can't just tell a samurai, knock that off. That's not how samurai are supposed to act. They kind of have the ability to turn around and say, how do you know how a samurai is supposed to act?
Wait, the samurai could say that to their daimyo?
Yeah, to a certain extent.
Interesting.
Which kind of gave them like a weird diplomatic immunity. So, as much as I tried to say that they exemplify this idea of honor, and also how later on this Confucianism was tied into it, which included things like kindness and being frugal and all this. The other aspect, though, that I think was more prevalent in the earlier samurai, so before the whole concept of the Bushido code was put into place, was it was quite possible for a samurai to just walk down the street of a village, and if someone got in his way, he could just slice them open and then keep walking, and no one could do anything about it.
Yeah, I have heard about that.
And the only people who can really judge, or then the only people who can really question him are the samurai. And even though the daimyo can be completely pissed off that this samurai has just killed a peasant who could be useful, he's not in the position to criticize, because that's kind of the sort of unwritten social contract between him and his samurai. His samurai are allowed to conduct themselves as they please, as long as it's not too overly detrimental to him, and they keep their unwavering loyalty towards him. So the only way you could solve that situation is if you brought in another samurai, but then that brings in the question of, will that other samurai actually question what his fellow did? Or would he be more akin to just let it slide, because then it lets his own actions slide, if you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's what I mean when I say it's a very contradictory system, in that it's meant to be about honor, and yet you could see many cases where, depending on the context of what your idea of honor is, they were probably acting relatively dishonorable.
Yeah.
An unrelated point that I just thought of was relating to Rome. As I just said earlier, that I thought that the European knight system was best, thanks in part to the social mobility that is possible. But I had just considered that in that system it is possible while it is possible for people to move between the classes, that's not if the person who moves up is genuinely going to be better suited to the higher position and is going to make the most of it and is going to be a worthy addition to the aristocracy, then that's a good thing. But of course you don't want, like you had said earlier, a knight begins training from a very young age to be a good knight, to know how to properly use his equipment and his position. And that made me think of the system of the Roman patricians, which probably a little too restrained in that it's basically impossible for someone to become a patrician unless they are born into it, but it is a guarantee that a patrician is going to be suited for the roles that they're going to be moving into. You know that they're going to make a good consul or senator or military officer because they've been born into this system that is prepared them from a young age to be ready for it, to know how to properly act in whatever role they may end up in. And in that in that system, I do think that there's a merit to having your aristocracy very closed off and I think there's a middle ground to be reached between the two systems where people can move between classes, but only under the circumstance that they will benefit the class, that they can be trusted to make the most of it, and that their children will then go on to assimilate into the class properly.
Well, yeah. So the idea is that you raise them up to the upper classes if they prove that they are already ready for it, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was getting at.
Yeah. Well, not to flatter or anything, but it seems like you've come across the more or less the same conclusion that a lot of other European, I guess whoever could be said to design these kind of social systems, the conclusions that they came to as well, because that is basically the model that became the later model for aristocracies, that you would have this set method for generating the kind of competencies that you would need in the aristocracy, but that itself was open to particularly exceptional people who were not of an aristocratic background. So, if before you were due to properly take on the duties or properly start the training, you were identified as somebody who would be particularly suited, then you would be sent off to the same kind of grammar schools and the same universities as the Blue Bloods.
Basically, a sort of like a system that allows for mobility without diluting the specialization of the aristocracy.
Yeah. And incidentally, this is one of the arguments against the abolition of grammar schools that happened in the 80s. Or, the effective abolition that had been underway partially before as well, but, got into full swing under Thatcher.
Good God, why does Thatcher ruin everything?
So, a reinstitution of that system then perhaps is how we could try and combine these two different things. But there certainly is something to be said for knowing exactly who's going to be in any position at a given time, and thus being able to prepare them for however many years are required beforehand. Assuming they have the physical competency to, the physical ability to do what you're asking them to.
Look forward to pointing at a grammar school in the future with my little sprog in tow being like, that's where the special people go. You're never going to go because you are painfully average.
I suppose the other thing to balance there is that I suppose it's not too much to reveal, but we're reading the Republic at the moment. I know. I think we mentioned it last week actually. I'm not sure.
I don't think.
Either way, this idea that you need a mechanism for if people are already prepared for it and already have the necessary knowledge and skills to be able to advance in society to where they need to be. But there's also the opposite, where you need people that if they're clearly not competent enough, there needs to be a way of taking them down a peg or two.
So yeah, exactly. This is the other side of meritocracy that needs to be borne in mind, is that not only do you need to have a system where you allow people who are not aristocrats to become part of the aristocracy, but you need to have a method wherein people who are members of the aristocracy who are clearly not suited can in some way drop out, or at least be sidelined from positions of authority.
Before they can damage everything.
Exactly, yeah.
That's what a monastery used to be for.
Yeah, quite probably, or at least that was a function of it, not necessarily intended, but something it did.
Unless you're a Martin Luther, in which case you piss off your parents by then going to the monastery.
There's quite a few, I think, who have gone down that same path. I'm just thinking about all the different people who either were supposed to go into a monastic school and then subsequently didn't, or were supposed to do something else and then subsequently decided to go to a monastic school, and it basically ruined the plans of their family.
Selfish dicks.
But yes, anyway, okay, just quickly then, do we know if there were any mechanisms, for example, for a samurai to become not a samurai anymore?
Seppuku?
I'm actually not sure, because again, seppuku didn't come in until Bushido itself was kind of properly founded.
Also, I assume that the children of samurai would still be part of the samurai.
Yes, they would. It was very much a distinct class. I use the word founding very lightly, like in quotation marks. That was more just, I think that was just someone coming along to try and neaten up the system a little bit, as opposed to just, coming down from on high, being like, here's this book of rules we want you to follow. Is more like, okay, here are these are rules that exist. Let's put them all together and make it a bit more defined. And that's only when seppuku came in. So I would highly doubt. Also, even after then, I'd highly doubt that ritualistic suicide would be the answer to how to remove someone from the samurai class.
Effective from a genetic perspective, perhaps not from a social perspective.
Yeah, so that's actually something I don't know. I would assume so, because obviously, as you say, things became, there was a gradual bureaucratization of Japan, and so you'd have to wonder if maybe maybe that's where some of the samurai that decided not to be samurai went. I know maybe they became merchants. I would have to actually look it up, because it's that's actually very unclear.
Well, usually with these kinds of martial aristocracies, it's prevented that they become merchants or engage in merchant activity. That's just a common theme. I don't know if specifically that's the case with the samurai.
I mean, I'd have to look it up. I was just spitballing ideas of what someone with the sort of level of autonomy and mobility that they had.
Yeah.
Because it was entirely possible for samurai to move from location to location. They weren't completely bound to where they were supposed to, completely bound to, the places of their birth.
Yeah. All right.
I mean, majority of them were, just because, you are born in, the in Oda clan territory, so you're going to swear your fealty to the Oda clan, that kind of thing.
Yeah. What about in the case of the Mandarin system then? I guess it's, well, stop me if I'm wrong, but the position that you had in the civil service was purely contingent on your ability to complete the exam, therefore there's no guarantee that your child would be able to enter the civil service just by being your child.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so the filtering is obvious. Sorry, what did you say?
I mean, that's almost entirely the point of it, and it's why it screwed over the aristocracy so much.
Not much to expand on there then. Obviously everyone's dropped out by default.
Mm.
What about in Rome? Was there any way for a patrician to become not a patrician anymore, do you know?
Not that I know of. I know that it was impossible for a pleb to become a patrician. No, I think it was that even if a patrician family had lost all their wealth and all their land and all their status, they were still patricians, because they're supposed to be, in a sense, the ancestors of Rome's founders.
Yeah.
That's awkward. I don't want to be a patrician anymore. Too bad, it's in your blood.
And in the case of knights, I have to admit ignorance, because I do not know if there was any way for a knightly family to not be a knight anymore.
Yeah, because
the
only context I have for a samurai kind of not being a samurai is when they become a ronin.
But does that tarnish the family that comes after them as well?
Tarnishes the family that comes after them. I don't think it tarnishes the family that's with them currently. Like if they have a sibling or something, then I don't think the sibling's affected.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Again, you'd have to double check me on that, because there is quite a big familial tie there, so the whole family might still get dishonored anyway. But even then, a ronin is still kind of a samurai. The only thing ronin would really do is they'd either try to regain their title as a samurai, regain their honor, or they were sellswords. So they would be, they could be they would join a professional army, but instead of being loyal to that lord, they would be they'd just get paid for it, which is not great. And even if that samurai that ronin came along wanting to be 100% loyal to that lord, they wouldn't accept it, because who wants loyalty from someone with no honor?
Yeah.
So you wanted to raise about. Sorry, I need to get this out, otherwise I'm afraid you might talk forever, Simon. Rupert, the knights, you could drop your status as a knight by going and becoming a monk or a cleric or something, right, by joining the church. Am I correct in saying that?
That is actually, true as far as I know.
Right, so let's say you're a knight, you've already got children, and then you decide to go and join the clergy. Do your children then lose their status?
A hunch says no, but it isn't really much more than a hunch. I don't think so. Because there was also generally an association of, although sometimes you had to purchase positions in the church when things in the very late Middle Ages got really corrupt in the church. But anyway,
so you could technically end an aristocratic line of knights by there being a single son and him immediately going and joining the church.
Oh yeah, but that would be because the family ended, not because.
Yep, that's a fair point.
Yeah. Bastards. They wouldn't be automatically ennobled. In fact, they would be ennobled. They would have to be ennobled as an act of decree. So that would be one way in which you wouldn't be a knight anymore. But that's not exactly meritocratic selection by any stretch. So yeah, it was just children in sort of official sanctioned marriages that would continue to be nobles or to continue to be knights. There's a bit of crossover, between nobles and knights.
Right.
Yeah, other than that, I don't know. I'm sorry.
We finally found something that Rupert doesn't know. Incredible.
Things we do not know.
Right. In that case, I think everybody else has basically stated what... has everybody stated which system they prefer?
No, not yet, actually.
No, I didn't think so, actually.
Yeah, so I think I started saying it, but didn't get to finish it. I think my personal favourite would be the knight system, just because I'm a filthy European, filthy blighty boy, unconscious bias. And also,
bias, it sounds like.
Some may refer to you as an eternal Anglo.
They may. But yeah, and I think it has a bit of a good mix between I suppose individual liberty, but maybe just more individual like social progression, and still retaining the values of your family and not screwing over your descendants.
Yeah, I think I on balance like the European system the most as well, but the European knight system, I should say. But there are certainly attractive things about the Japanese system, I would say. So in particular, the loyalty, and like I said, how that reduces the coordination costs, to not be second guessed by your own subordinates all the time. I think that has a lot of value in terms of being able to act in a decisive and cost effective and quick manner.
And just to be real quick, I know I said I just said mine was not the samurai system. I will say I'm more leaning towards the European knight system as well, and purely because of the fact that my issue with the Japanese system is just the rules are a bit contradictory and not very... It's very much a clear-cut case of rules were made and then rules were added without much concern for what previous rules entail. And that just makes it even more confusing, whereas while you could say the chivalric code is overly idealistic and is not a standard people can reach, it's still very clear what the standards are and where they are as a hierarchy compared to the Japanese system where like I said before, for loyalty to your lord takes place over loyalty to your family and all that nonsense.
Yeah, that I'm not a big fan of that part, it must be said. I think overall I'll round it out by saying the European system is the one that, the European knight system is the one that I like the most as well. So, guess we're all just a bunch of filthy Europhiles. What was that, sorry, Simon?
Basically, I think we both said the same thing, basically. I said we're all filthy Europhiles.
Yeah.
And on that note...
yeah. Newsflash, for European nationalists, think that European aristocratic system was the best. Or at 11.
Mm-hmm. I am so absolutely shocked and stunned.
I guess there's an interesting conversation that we could carry this on at some other time about, again, how this system evolved, being that we've decided on it as the preferable. I mean, completely arbitrary. The selection of 4 was not informed by, the 4 best systems that ever there were. It's just, there's the 4 that we chose, but we might as well stick on it and kind of have a look into further how it developed.
Yeah, I mean, we could also look at it in, terms of what you'd take from each one if there were any positives you'd like.
Yeah, we've already touched on that. I think we get some good conversation out of that. So, for now, I think until next time. Yeah, should we leave it?
Yeah,
Sure.
I think it's about time we leave it. This one off.
Yeah. All right. Goodbye then, everyone.
Bye.
Farewell.